anyways, let's go through and let's talk about Inside Star Citizen. I know it has something to do with the Polaris because Fizz has been trying to spoil it for the whole day by posting images in the Discord. But I haven't seen them. I've seen them, but I haven't looked at them. But let's jump into it. Also, it has something to do with builds too, I heard. So, yeah.
Well, builds can break for a ton of reasons. It's not a point of pride that, I start to rattle off a whole bunch of different things that break builds, because my whole vocation is to create tools, to create pipelines, and to create processes that don't break builds, that are very, very dependent. But in a perfect world, that might be the case, but in the reality of things, it can be so many things. There can be a perforce commit that completely destroys it. There's so many different types of errors. There can be a compilation error that fails the build. There can be build errors that have nothing to do with the actual game data itself. We're trying to move away from these kind of things, but having assets, single points of failures on certain assets. So a good example is like in our facial data, we use a thing called a DNA wrap deformer, and it literally just came up this last week that there was a wrap deformer attachment checked in that didn't have an LOD. Any face that was attaching this would fatal the entire game. As soon as QA got into it, every 2 seconds they were having a fatal error, which means the entire build sort of shut down on them and they couldn't proceed with their testing. So this is one of the reasons that we put those asset validations. And
I will say, just from a guy that does modding, build failures is way more common than people think it is. It sucks, but yeah, I can actually show you guys. Here is some coding for Imperium Galactic Survival. So we'll look at this, right? Obviously, this is the Stargate mod that I'm making. Group name is Ancient Stargate version 1, which is obviously the Stargate. Faction none. Shield reload is true. Count 1. Spawn a near point that's been hashed out. And properties. That controls the music. That discovers the discovery. And that allows you to regen after so many minutes of, if the options in the game. So like here, group name is just the name of the group for the blueprints. Fraction is Earth, Human, Gold, whoever it may be. Shield reload is whether the shield will actually reload or whether it will actually not. Now obviously no shield reload is set true, so it won't reload its shield. There's no shield on it anyway. Count 1 of 1. So if I put 0 of 1, for example, that will spawn anywhere between 0 and 1. Or if I put 0 and 5, that'll spawn anywhere between 0 and 5 of them. Obviously, I've got a max is 1, minimum is 1. Spawn near POI is Ancient Ruins Central. That's been hashed out because this is a copy from previous coding. And then obviously music and discovery and regen. So as I say, it's, build, and anything in that can cause it to failure. I've literally had failures on builds where, for example, I've hit the space, the tab instead of the space key, and that's caused it to fail. Or in Imperium we call it a COD error. But yeah, COQ error.
And those things in place. There is a lot of reason that builds fail, and part of the tool's job is making sure that those don't happen. So what is a build? The easiest way to understand a build is everybody's heard of code compiling before, and that is there's raw code that is written, and then it gets run through a compiler, and then out comes a binary or an executable as people would understand it. The same actually happens with our assets. So sometimes our assets come through and they'll be in an intermediate type format, and then those will get sent over to the build system to be compressed in such a way that it's actually a lot easier for us to deliver the build to users, and for the build to actually be able to run a lot quicker.
In order to distribute a version of the game to all the developers so that we can continue producing the game, we create what we call a build many times a day. As work is completed, it gets submitted to our source control system, Perforce, which is basically a way of just holding all of the assets, all of the code, everything that goes into producing the game. This obviously is being done by hundreds of developers in different studios across the world.
So when a developer comes in the morning, they need to be able to depend on the build for the day. And the first build of the day, they're going to expect that all the stuff that they checked in the night before is actually present in that build so that they can continue to iterate on what they've been working on. So a build failing is a big deal. It actually brings down the entirety of the company on that particular change list. So there's a whole bunch of ways that we actually protect the build against failures like this. We run the assets through something called asset validation, and what this is a pre-commit check. You can also call it health checks for the assets. So we run these through what is this validation. It checks for all the common errors that we would possibly make to the data.
And it's very important because when you're developing in the editor, it can check what you're doing within that one level, but it can't look at a holistic approach. So the editor itself will produce various checks to make sure that what's exported is in good shape. But the asset validator is very much a complement to that, checking things that they cannot check at that time.
And then if there's no errors, it allows them to commit it. If there is errors, it tells them exactly what to do about it. They go and fix it, and then are able to commit again, and we should be safe on the build. So we had a tool in place since I got here to CIG, actually, and it started as a very, very small little Python script. And over time, as with any tool, it got a little more robust, but as it got robust, it also got very confusing to continue to build out.
It's showing its age. There's been a lack of structure to it, and it's been very difficult to maintain and to keep up to date.
So what we wanted to do was make sure that not only was it just the tools team able to write asset validation, but also the rest of the teams. And what that required was a more robust framework. It's sort of a plugin kind of approach. So we moved it from Python over to C#, and now we have much, much broader adoption for all the teams so that they can write their own levels of asset validation within the tool as well.
So of course, a big win for the tools team here is that we don't need to create all these tests. We can allow the experts in the other teams to do it for us.
Other teams among the company, as we've scaled up quite a bit comparatively to the older tools, can actually write asset validation inside of this framework. So this was a really important part of the new tool. Now it does everything that the old one already did, but now our scalability is so much broader.
So as we can...
So I know probably a bit of this is going to be going over people's heads. So what they're doing, right, was they started with just a Python script. Python is a very basic computer code language. It's great, don't get me wrong, but it's pretty basic. And as time progressed, they added more and more to it. So to give you a real life example, going back to my C++ here, right? So here, for example, this is a damaged outpost, right? This code was put in there right after the Stargate. So the first thing it does is spawns the Stargate, then it spawns the damaged outpost. Now, at the moment, it spawns anywhere from 3 to 5. So this is similar to what they were doing, right? So they would go through, and this was the first part of the code, right? This is the Python code here. And then as they needed to do things, they added more and more. Like they added this, right, as an add-on. But the problem is that after a couple of years or whatever, it started to look like this. And that's where it starts to get messy, because the more coding that you put in, the more linkage that happens between areas, the more risk things can go wrong, and it just becomes really, really complicated to manage. So it sounds like they've gone through and they've rewritten the coding, which, believe me, we happened way more than people know. I've rewritten this code. This is version 2 of all this code. They've gone through and rewritten all this code and basically gone through and written it so that it's in C#, which is a better programming language. Well, not better, but more advanced. And basically allows them to go through. And what it does now is, instead of the tools team having to sit there and program in all the assets and all the checks, the people in those departments can do it probably through checkboxes and radio boxes and stuff like that. Right? So if you're like lighting, for example, and you have to check the shadows assets and stuff like that, you can go through and you can program it just by saying, yes, I want you to check shadows. And it'd be like checkboxes and drop-down boxes and stuff like that. So it gives the guys that develop these assets better options for checking, because they're the ones that need to know what needs to be fixed. Your tool programmers and stuff like that, they're great at programming all this sort of stuff, but they probably don't know shit about shadows, for example. Or they might not know shit about, actual assets or whatever it may be, right? So if you can get those guys to sit there and program it themselves, then obviously they're going to know exactly what needs to be checked. So, look, obviously this causes not downtime, but this causes the project to be delayed slightly, because obviously they've got to go through and rewrite all these codes. This is obviously stuff that they could be spending other time on, but this is a hugely important thing, because keeping those builds working and not failing, like they say, it basically allows them to keep working for the day or until that build is fixed. If it fails, you know, like for example, the guys that are writing the source code for like hover mode, for example, you know, they can't do any more work because they're waiting for the build to be fixed. Because they're going to need to write the code and then they're going to need to check it. And they can't if the build is failing and people are having to update the code and stuff like that. There could also be rollbacks and stuff like that. So it's good to see that they're actually keeping on top of this code. But yeah, we'll keep going.
Continue to develop Star Citizen, we get ever more complicated systems and therefore ever more complicated assets, and in particular dependencies between them get ever more convoluted. So it's very important that we can have a scalable system that allows contribution from everybody to help address the potential issues that this could incur.
So the exact same way as a player might be excited for a feature coming from a feature team within CIG, we have developers excited for a tool that may be coming from the tools developer within CIG. It's very much the same paradigm. So when we bring up new asset validation, they appreciate having this because they need to know about those errors up front. They don't want to wait for the build to fail, for some producer to come to their desk and go, why has this failed? Why has your asset not worked out? For players especially, this is going to matter.
And obviously, the less the managers are having to come up to the actual workers to say, hey, why did your lighting build fail? Or why did the lighting part of this build fail? It obviously means that the lighting team doesn't have to sit through thousands of pages of coding trying to find what went wrong. To give you an idea, a real life example, in one of my builds for Imperium, it took me 3 days to find out what happened to my build, and it was because I hit tab instead of space. You know, it can be as simple as that. Alright, let's keep going.
For you, because as you've been waiting for a PTU build or an ePTU build, these failed builds slow these things down. And if we can't review them, we can't QA internally, that means a release doesn't go out. So we're trying to nab it right at the very beginning. So that developer knowing that there is a problem before it hits the build, before it fails to the build, and before it delays a release for you guys. So the tools team is incredibly important as far as the developers, players, and builds go. And hopefully this means more builds will make it to players' hands.
I hope you've enjoyed this brief look into the tools team and one of our products, and hope we see you again in the verse.
While much of Star Citizen's continuing development is dedicated to creating gameplay systems like cargo and salvage, new locations like rivers, sand caves, and crash sites, missions like the new prison escape, the Horizon platform stuff, the time trial races, and everything else that's heading our way in the upcoming Alpha 3.18, the folks that are focused on the making and iteration of tools to help the very process of game creation itself are an essential element of the game dev gumbo that we make here. And we're always thrilled when we can give them a few minutes to shine. But up next, the long-awaited, often rumored, Polaris concept model internal layout rework. Now, it's not a series of new concept images like those that were created for the 600i we showcased a few weeks ago, but this is a down-in-the-rough 3D Max model look at the reworked concept mesh to explore the new internal layout so potential pirates can begin plotting out their boarding actions. Enjoy.
The Polaris is obviously...
So, before they start, the interesting thing here is they've said it's a rework. So that means they've gone through and they've reevaluated the Polaris. There was a design, they've redone it, and this is the second edition of it. Now, I heard, I think it was Fez that was saying, that the reason why they had to do a rework was because of ship matrix. Things didn't line up, things were too small, things were too big, hallways and stuff like that, doors and all that sort of stuff, so they had to go through and rework it. And apparently it has grown in size, but I presume we'll hear about that in a sec.
Really, really old concept. It's been around for a very, very long time. It's one of the
more early ships that we did the exterior concept art for.
The Polaris came out in, I think, 2017. Lots of features have been added to the game since then that were not known about at that time or couldn't be planned for if they were known about.
Like a lot of the older ships, the interior just didn't fit. We couldn't get the size, the scale, or the metrics for how we would want it to appear to actually fit inside the frame that we had.
We've really now locked in how we want the interior layout, what the impact of the exterior means, but it's still the same Polaris that everyone originally saw and fell in love with. It just means that now it's kind of fit for purpose, whereas with the initial concepting phase and initial layout, it wasn't quite where we needed it to be.
The exterior remains pretty much the same, beyond it has got larger to accommodate some of the interior
There we go.
changes. The role is the
That's what we heard. We heard that it had gotten bigger because of the fact that it didn't fit.
same, the key visuals are the same. You may notice, again, some like panel line changes or turret updates, but fundamentally you look at the Polaris now versus then, it's almost indistinguishable aside from that scale change, and the role remains identical to what it was before.
Moving
Looks
on the
good.
inside, however, we have a completely different story. Although there wasn't much seen for what the inside was going to look like, we had to remove a lot of that and just start again. We fit the entirety of the interior inside of it while taking into account the change in component sizes.
Where we went from size 0 all the way up to size 10, whereas now we've got much more kind of distinct categorization of our components.
We've now got a capital shield generator, capital power plant, capital cooler, all to support the actual size of the ship and the scale of it,
Looks
especially
good.
for what its role is within the actual universe. So, talking layout, we don't have concept images for every single room within the ship, but I can give you an estimation of what you can expect from it. So, you start from the bridge, which has been opened up a bit to give you a bit more space and visibility. Behind that, we then have the escape pod section, where there's escape pods for all the crew to be able to quickly evacuate the ship. Moving behind that, we then have the captain's quarters and office, as well as the CO's office. Behind that again, we then have the armory. Moving further back, we have the crew bunk room and baths and showers. Across from that, we then have the rec area, so it's where the food is, it's where the relaxation is for the actual crew of the ship. Moving back further, we then come towards the centre of the ship, where the actual hangar of the Polaris is, and that's had a bit of a size increase so that it's very comfortable to fit things like a saber in it now.
Cool.
On the left and right hand side, on one side you have the medical facilities. On the other you have the holding cells for any prisoners or wrongdoers that you might get hold of. And then moving back you then have the entrance of where engineering is, which spans about 2 decks. A small section of it is at the rear, which houses some of the more standard components. Then the lower deck of engineering holds the large capital components for the Polaris. Moving back forward then from the rear, we then have the cargo hold. Moving forward from the cargo area, we then have the torpedo room, which has all of the torpedoes stored and an operations station if anyone needs to maintain any work down there.
2 stations, well.
The Polaris is concept complete. We're pretty happy with the updates to it internally, and hope you are as well. And now
So, bridge, escape pod, main elevator, captain's room, CO room, turrets are obviously there, yeah. Bathroom, I don't know what this room here is. Mess room, maybe it's empty. Bunk room. Then you got the hangar. And then you've got, presumably down here is the engineering.
we are just at the point of
Medical,
scheduling
yeah.
when we can jump it into production. It's naturally a large ship, slightly larger than it was. So it's not going to be a quick endeavor, but we think it's going to be a pretty fruitful one by the end of it.
The lessons that we've learned over the years from the evolution of making ships and their interiors have all come into play when we've done the Polaris. And I can't wait for people to be able to see it.
So, what did we learn this week? Well, we learned a bit about the build system, how it can break, how it affects development, and how the new asset validation tool and the work of the tools teams themselves aim to combat that day in and day out. that the Polaris concept model internal layout rework is the last necessary step before that much beloved vehicle.
I must admit, I like the Polaris. It's a bit too big for me, but I know John in chat Discord, he has been deciding between the Polaris and the Perseus. The best thing about them working on the Polaris is that things like, for example, the Galaxy and the Perseus can use the same assets. So, you know, they can basically knock out 3 ships pretty quick.
Can move into production proper sometime in the future. And that if you want more information about the process of ship creation and everything that's involved, including a detailed breakdown of the newly revamped vehicle pipeline and a candid discussion of the where, when, and why of all things making spaceships, be sure you check out this year's IAE Special Edition Star Citizen Live up on YouTube. For Inside Star Citizen, I'm Jared Huckabee. We'll see you all here next week.
What was that? I was sort of...
Citizen Live up on YouTube. For Inside discussion of the where, when, and why of all things making spaceships, be sure you check out this year's IAE Special Edition Star Citizen Live up on YouTube.
That must be...
For
Did that go up today? Yesterday. That was last week's, yeah. Go.
And an operation station if anyone needs to maintain on.
IAE Special Edition Star Citizen Live up on YouTube. For Inside Star Citizen, I'm Jared Huckabee. We'll see you all here next week.
Well, maybe that's tomorrow's? They said Star Citizen Live. Alright guys, yeah, at the end of the day, obviously I like the Polaris. It's interesting. Like I said, it's a bit too big for me. But as for ships go, it's going to wreck some days. And like I say, the best thing about the Polaris, obviously, is the fact that they can use the same assets for the Galaxy and the Perseus. So, yeah, I like it. Guys, let me know what your thoughts are in that comment section below. Obviously, this video has been helpful. Please smack that like button. If you're new to the channel, welcome and subscribe. Apart from that, guys, we'll see you in the next demonetized video from YouTube. Have a great night. Enjoy yourself.